let's talk about books. Specifically, books I read in July. 2 weeks into August. Sorry about that. That's okay. Better late than never, right? Right. So there's a lot of them, and I have a lot of thoughts, so I'm going to try to be concise and quick so I don't take up too much of your time. Let's start with Reading Rush books. So, book number 1 is The Martian by Andy Weir. I talked about this a little bit already in my Reading Rush vlogs. The Martian follows Mark Watney, who's an astronaut who's presumed dead by his crew, and gets left on Mars, and has to basically survive on Mars and figure out how to make his supplies last long enough that somebody on Earth or someone in his crew will realize that he's still alive and be able to do something to potentially rescue him. This book could have been a horror sci-fi because it's a terrifying situation, but I think Mark Watney's dark sense of humor makes the book hilarious while also terrifying because you're very afraid for his life. And I think that marrying of two styles was done really well by Andy Weir. My one concern was that Mark Watney's voice, especially at the beginning, felt a little bit childish, like he was writing to a YA audience rather than an adult audience, and that was like a little bit off-putting at first, but as the book progresses and as the stakes get higher, I think that childish vibe went away a little bit, and there's some other voices in the book, and those voices weren't childish at all. So the blending of all those things meant that by the end of the book, I really could ignore the childish voice, and it wasn't a big deal at all. And there's so much science and math in it, which, as a nerd, I really enjoyed. And even if you don't like science and math that much, I think you can still really enjoy the story because of, like what I said, Mark Watney's humor is so on point. So that's my take. Book number 2, Red, White, and Royal Blue by Casey McQuiston. This book has been talked about a lot already on BookTube, so I don't know if there's much that I can say that hasn't already been said. The TLDR is that it's a love story between the son of the president and the prince of England, and it kind of follows an alternate timeline where a woman is the president and not Trump, and it's like this love story between these two boys. It's this hate to love relationship, and I think my one complaint would be that I think the hate lasted not long enough. It switched to friendship and love too quickly, in my opinion, and so the payoff of that shift wasn't as satisfying as it could have been. Beyond that, I really enjoyed this book. I think sometimes people are a little bit unhappy because it does get quite political and deviates a little bit from the love aspect and like the romance aspect in a lot of ways, but I think I really enjoyed that because it made the stakes of the relationship really high, right? The fact that it's a gay relationship and it's on this global scale and there's real political repercussions if people find out, and things could go so badly for them. And so I really enjoyed that, and I think the second half of the book tends to be more political, less romancy, and I was very happy with that, to be honest. So yeah, that was the second book that I read. Okay, the next book that I read was The Thing Around Your Neck by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. I talked about this already in my reading updates video a couple weeks back, maybe a month back now, I don't know, yikes. But I finished it. This was a short story collection that takes place in Nigeria and America and talks about the relationship between men and women and America and Nigeria and all these different ways in which cultures collide or blend and how sexism and racism affects all these different people. And I loved this book. I think what was really interesting is that I read it with my mom and we would discuss every story after we finished it, and her opinions on the book were often really different than mine, which I thought was super cool. There were certain things where she was shocked because Lagos was so similar to India, and I thought it was really interesting to hear her talk about her growing up and how her experiences were similar or different to the main characters in Ngozi Adichie's short stories. I especially like the stories that talked about America and Nigeria, I think, because as a second generation immigrant, I always had that question in my mind of how to blend those two cultures, and am I giving up a part of myself if I adopt a part of American culture, or am I diluting my Indianness somehow? I think she did a really good job of talking about sexism and racism and the kind of putting of Western culture on a pedestal compared to any other cultures, and how that's so nonsensical, but we accept it so often. Okay, the next book that I read was First and Then by Emma Mills. First and Then is a book about, it's this girl, and she's a senior in high school and kind of unsure about what she wants out of the rest of her life, and if she wants to go to college, and if so, where. And she has this best friend, Cass, who she loves. And then there's this other guy that she meets and instantly gets bad vibes from, but then her cousin, who is basically living with them now because of a situation with his parents, ends up becoming really close to this guy. And there's whole love story thing ensues. I think I said pretty much all that I needed to say about First and Then in my Reading Rush vlog. The TLDR is that Devin, our main character, goes through a lot of character growth, which is good, but I never really saw the driving force behind that character growth. Like, the change would happen and that would be good, but I wouldn't really understand why that change had occurred. And so that was a little bit frustrating. And then also, the two characters that end up getting together, I wish we had seen more cute scenes between them, because they only interacted like 5 times in the entire book, and I wanted them to interact more so that when they got together it made more sense and I was more excited by it. Because I did think that they were really cute and I liked both of them individually. I just wish that their coming together was more detailed on the page. And I'm glad I read it, even if I wouldn't necessarily read it again. The next book I want to talk about is Beach Read by Emily Henry. Now, this book is also making the rounds on BookTube, and to be honest, I read this really early in the month, so I remember very little about what I thought. Let me think. This book basically follows these two people who went to college together and hated each other in college, and then they end up both becoming authors, one of romances and one of thrillers and really dark, sad books, and they end up living next door to each other in this really rural town, and they're both totally writer's blocked. They both have to write new things and have nothing left to write about. And they decide to switch genres and see what happens and try writing an entirely different book than what they're used to and kind of working together in that. And so it's this hate to love, and I really liked this book. I thought it was very cute, and it was cool to see their kind of writing styles and how they researched differently and how they worked. And overall, I was always excited to come back to this book and keep reading it. I think I don't know, man, like maybe romance is just not my genre, because I keep finding myself slightly unsatisfied by the end of a book. I always wanted a little bit more to have been shown or a little bit more to have happened, and it's always like close but not quite enough. And I think that was the same thing with this book. And honestly, at a certain point, I think it's a me problem and not all the romance books I've been reading problem, because I haven't been totally satisfied with a love story that I've read in years, maybe? I don't know. Hard to say. But that being said, it was super cute. The premise was awesome. I liked both of the characters, which is great. Especially if you're less picky than me, I think it would be very enjoyable. The next book I read is also a romance. Wow, I read a lot of I think I was craving romances this month and sort of scratched the itch, but not quite, because none of these books hit quite as perfectly as I wanted them to. But the next book I read was The Bride Test by Helen Huang, which I've already talked about in a different video, so I'll just really quickly summarize it. The Bride Test is a book about this woman who lives in Vietnam, I believe, and basically meets this really rich woman, and the woman asks her, "Do you want to marry my son and come to America?" And she's like, "Okay," and then she comes to America and meets this guy, and he's very nice and great, and he has Asperger's, I believe, and like that representation is really great, and both the characters were great, I think. I don't know. I think that there's this trope that happens in a lot of romances, including both The Bride Test and Beach Read, where authors equate telling somebody about really traumatic things that happened in your life to like romantic relationship development. And I think I need to see more of just the mundane interactions and see them getting along and being happy and being good for each other, and not just like, oh, I told them the 2 most traumatic things that happened in my life, now I'm in love with them. It's just too fast and not that realistic for me, I think. So that was my qualm, I think, with this book. But a lot of people really love it, and so it might be for you, even if it wasn't for me. The next book I read was What Is Not Yours Is Not Yours by Helen Oyeyemi, and man, was this book good. I mean, so good. This is another short story collection, and it takes place in a lot of different places around the world and follows a lot of characters of color and a lot of LGBTQ characters, and every story is so interesting, and some of the stories are connected to each other. Like, you'll see characters pop up in each other's stories, which was awesome. I really like it when that happens in books. This book is a book that I really want to buy, because I borrowed it from the library, and by the time I had to return it, I felt like I needed to reread the entire thing. Like I didn't feel like I got everything. I needed to understand more. It felt so layered and nuanced and interesting and weird in the perfect way, and I would highly recommend it. I can't promise that you'll understand it perfectly. Maybe you'll understand it better than I did, but every story was just the perfect amount of magical realism or mystical or confusing in a really satisfying way, and all of the mysteries weren't totally wrapped up, which is also really satisfying, but then you got little snippets of other people's mysteries in the other stories, and it was just a really enjoyable ride. I don't know how to describe it. I think it's never happened to me before that I finished a book and immediately I'm like, I need to reread this entire thing. Like I just want to reread every single thing. I want to like take notes. I want to think about what it means. Like the entire time it was just begging to be unpacked and understood and analyzed, and I just want to do that. So maybe I'll buy this book someday so I can actually write in it and think about it more without the worry of having to return it in 3 weeks. I would super recommend this book. It will be confusing, but it will be a good kind of confusing. The kind of confusing that you're satisfied with, you know? The next book I read, My Dark Vanessa by Kate Elizabeth Russell. I have already talked about this book a lot, and I cannot talk about it enough. I really loved it. It follows this young girl who enters this relationship with her 40-year-old professor. She's like 15 when it starts, and it's her throughout her life, and kind of realizing the way in which that relationship damaged her years later, and also realizing more about him as certain allegations come out about him. And I think it so perfectly shows how a young kid could get swept up in a relationship and think it's love and think that they're equal, even when they realize the red flags, and even when they're smart enough to know that there's things that are unbalanced, and also shows the ways in which that unhealthy imbalance of power continues to impact her years in the future, and also how she slowly comes to terms with it and also doesn't come to terms with it in a lot of ways. And I think it's a really good story, and it's important that these stories are out there because there's so much fetishization of teenagers and young girls in our world, and I think having a story that points out the deep flaws in that fetishization is really important. It was painful to read, and there were so many lines and parts where I was just so sad and disgusted, but it was such an important book to read, and I'm very glad that I did. The next 2 books that I read were Blue Lily Lily Blue and The Raven King, both by Maggie Stiefvater. They're both the last 2 books in the Raven cycle, and this series of books has a lot of love on BookTube and in the world in general, and I think I just don't have any of the nostalgia attached to it that a lot of other people do, so I didn't love it quite as much, and I think I also had the same problem that I have with a lot of romances where I just didn't feel like I ever saw the people who I was supposed to be rooting for really fall in love necessarily. All the romantic relationships in the book could have been developed more, even though the friendship relationships and the dynamics were very good, I think. Yeah, I don't know. I think the whole series in general is just like a middle of the road series for me. Like, it's not something that I'll read again. It's not something I disliked while I was reading it. I got bored at some parts. I was really interested in other parts. Overall, I can see why it's so well loved, and I think it's a really perfect series for a lot of people. It's got a strong central friend group. It's got some magical aspects of it, which is really cool. Yeah, this is exactly how I described it already. Just a lot of the threads weren't wrapped up as satisfyingly as I wanted them to be, and so I just wanted there to be fewer plot lines, all better developed in the page count that Stiefvater had. That was my takeaway. And the last book that I'm talking about is Lock Every Door by Riley Sager. This book was so good. Oh my god. Okay, so the premise is it follows this woman in her 20s, and she has just been cheated on by her boyfriend, so she's moving out, and she needs a job because she's just gotten fired, and she gets hired to basically apartment sit this apartment in this really beautiful old historic building, the Bartholomew in New York. And it seems like a dream come true. She's getting paid to live for 3 months in this super high-end fancy apartment. And then weird things start to happen, and she starts to realize that maybe things aren't as good as they seem. This thriller was so good. So often there's thrillers where there's all this mystery and there's so much potential, and then when you finally get to the end, you're just a little bit unsatisfied because you're like, I was kind of hoping that it would be cooler, or the prospect of discovering the truth of the mystery oftentimes ends up being better than the actual explanation of the mystery. And I think this book did a really, really good job of keeping you on your seat the entire time, but also interspersing clues to the final ending throughout the book, such that you could have guessed it maybe, but once you finally understand what's happening, it didn't feel out of the blue. It didn't feel like a twist for the sake of a twist. It felt like, oh, this makes perfect sense. I probably could have seen this from the very beginning if I read it knowing that this is how it ended, which is exactly how I like my thrillers. Basically, would recommend. You should definitely read it. It was so creepy. I was terrified for so much of it, and I was just, I'm not very good at reading thrillers. I think I get scared pretty easily, but it was one of those books that I just had to keep on and on reading because I needed to know what happened. Also, the cover is beautiful. So cool. I love the cover. Yeah, okay. That's all I have to say about that book. That's all the books I read in July. All told, I read 11 books, which is a really good reading month for me, so I'm very happy. I read a lot of books I really liked. Probably my 3 favorite books of the month were maybe Lock Every Door, What Is Not Yours Is Not Yours, and My Dark Vanessa. Yeah, so What Is Not Yours Is Not Yours, Lock Every Door, and My Dark Vanessa were definitely my 3 favorite books of this month, but all the books I read were definitely not, there was not a single book that I actively disliked, even if I was sort of meh about it. There was no book that I disliked, and there was plenty of books that I loved. Yeah, I'd say that that's a win. Hopefully I read more in August. So far I've read like maybe 2 books. Once my internship is over, I'll have 10 days before school starts, and so I'll just try to read a lot then, I guess. I'm very hopeful about the month, but also realistic in that not every month can be a really prolific reading month, or else I'll get drained and I won't want to read anymore, and I don't want to do that to myself. So yeah, that's where I'm at. Thank you for watching this video. Bye.